So if you haven't heard the news, CA is rumoured to be building an entirely new genre of Total War, which is Star Wars. This would be a massive gamble, but if they could succeed, it would be a game that I don't think we've seen the likes of since Shogun 2 Total War. This game could be a massive success or a gigantic failure. These are just my opinions, so please leave a comment down below and like this video to get this conversation going. I genuinely love reading your comments because I don't have all the answers, and I love to hear what you guys think. Let's start off then with an overview. What a Star Wars Total War game would actually look like. Now this will be different from both historical and fantasy games for reasons I'll get into later, but it really would be in its own separate genre. And this comes with many problems. We've seen over the last couple of years the disaster that Starfield has been. And just to give an example, when I was compiling my notes for this video, I forgot the name of the game, Starfield, and had to search Space Skyrim into Google to figure it out. That's how irrelevant this game's become. Even though it's actually pretty good graphically, it's just so sparse of content that people just don't have a focal point, unlike Skyrim, which was very much a brand new experience. It was really interesting, the characters are really interesting, there's so much to do. And Starfield's player count numbers are so bad that Skyrim is beating its current player count. So that's how crazy it is. My point is that space games can be incredibly hard to get right. And so Creative Assembly have got to be incredibly careful when they're approaching this. It's not something you can just wing. It's going to take some careful appreciation for not just the Star Wars lore, but the dynamics of space in game design. Probably the biggest hurdle that CA will have to overcome when releasing this product is that it will be untested. Now, you might say that Warhammer had to overcome this same issue, and you'd be correct, but Warhammer had the unique position of already being part of another franchise in that it was already a fully fledged tabletop game with rules, lore, and characters that were balanced, engaging, and tested. All CA had to do, and I'm not saying this wasn't a big ask, was to take the tabletop game and turn it into a real-time game. Now, a Star Wars game would have some of those things too, the lore, the characters, etc., but it's not a tabletop franchise. It's not built around an understanding of a balanced game. It doesn't have defined rules. It doesn't have already established playstyles and units. A Star Wars Total War game would have the potential to forsake the two fundamentals of Total War, one being real-time grand strategy battles, and the second being turn-based campaign focused on long-term planning. Those are the two aspects of a Total War game. So let's take the campaign first. How would one build a Total War style Star Wars campaign? First of all, let's look at a great legacy example, which if you haven't heard of before is fantastic. It's Star Wars Empire at War. Even though this game is old, and I mean it's old, it has given us to date the best RTS Star Wars experience, still to this day, mind you. And the biggest difference between Star Wars Empire at War and a Total War game is that the campaign is not turn-based, it's real-time. So for example, if you're moving your fleet, the enemy can also be moving their fleet at the same time. And the reason they did this is that Planetary Warfare in this universe, in the Star Wars universe especially, is immediate. So now, I'm not a Star Wars lore master, and I know that there's probably a limit to hyperdrive or whatever you want to call it, and where you could theoretically use it, etc. But even if there was a limit of how far you could travel, it would still be massive. But how can you strategically plan when you're sitting one turn, for hypothetically, nice and safe, and you're planning, building your forces, and the next turn or the next phase of the game, whatever, the enemy fleet just randomly appears and invades your planet. You're forced into an engagement without strategic thought, and more often than not, a lack of decision. So initiative will be insanely important in this game. And if you're on the back foot in a campaign, you're going to start reacting, not initiating conflict. And whilst trying to come back from the brink of disaster can be a great experience, if this is how the game plays every single time, the AI just bombarding with fleets coming out of hyperdrive all the time, it's going to be a disastrous, infuriating player experience, never being able to get anywhere. So what can you do to mitigate this? Well, what Star Wars Empire at War did was to make the campaign real time, as we've already mentioned. So the AI is not just able to steamroll you whenever it's their turn. You have time to react to their moves. But Star Wars Empire at War takes a different approach. Rather than a completely sandbox game, it initiates linear lines of connectivity between planets. So for example, you can't go wherever you want, you have to go down a certain path and not all planets to connect to each other, even though they might be somewhat close to each other. Now, this obviously isn't realistic because you could just travel wherever you want, but they probably had the same problem when designing their game. The AI may have attacked you at their home planet immediately, so they had to implement some sort of system. And this is the best way they could find to combat it, and it was fine. It worked really well for this kind of game. Using the technology they had, a decade ago, it's an impressive feat, considering it's still one of the most impressive Star Wars games out there, and the mods on it are just astronomical. They've managed to micro down to scale space battles. It's just incredible. If you haven't played it before, it's definitely worth the buy. But the problem with Total War Star Wars implementing linear travel between planets is that you remove a very important reason that you play a Total War game and not this game. Even in Rome Total War 1, you could start your game as the Romans and follow the Senate's guidelines to invade Greece or Gaul or wherever, or you could just ignore everything, build up a big army and sail to Egypt, build up a foothold there, build up a huge economy base there, which would then fuel your European campaign. This is actually a great strategy, but the game doesn't necessarily push you to do that, but it's your own imagination that does. And this was the excitement of Total War. You could do anything anywhere. You could invade Greece, Cyprus, Britannia. There wasn't any restrictions. You weren't necessarily going to lose the game. I mean, it was a risk, but it was a risk that if paid off was a great reward. And you could play the game however you wanted to, which is why it was so successful. And to this day, people still make Let's Plays on YouTube with Rome Total War 1 because it is such a free game that it's actually really exciting to watch. If Star Wars Total War went down the same route as Empire at War and implemented these linear paths between planets, it will remove a very big aspect of Total War, which is player freedom. You'd only be allowed to move down a certain way. You'd have to follow this certain linear guidelines. And so what's the answer then? And it has to be something between two positions, right? It has to be in the middle. It can't just be you can go anywhere you want because the AI will just go completely insane and start attacking you. And also you can cheese the AI pretty easily with that as well. But it also can't be so linear that you only have one pathway because you may as well not be playing that game. You may as well play Empire at War. I want to hear your comments on this because there isn't really a defined option. It's just going to be however they create it. So drop a comment down below if you have an idea of how to implement this, what this could be. I'm generally going to be interested. I might even make a second video and reply to some of those in real time, which I think will be really interesting. But this is what worries me. Whatever formula they choose will be untested on the consumer, and you could have this Rome Total War 2-esque launch where it's all just a complete mess and it doesn't work at all. So they've got to game test this whole new system. If there has to be a new system, it can't be one or the other. It has to be a brand new system. And it could work in some ways, but just like, remember Empire, Total War multi-continental system was really cool. The scale was so big, the AI just didn't understand how to work it at all. And the scale of a space campaign over multiple systems and planets would make it extremely complex and also extremely hard to program. It could require such a drastic change to a traditional campaign map that you may go from such a change as Medieval 1, where you just move things around a board, to Rome 1, where you'd have the option to ambush, move wherever you really wanted. Are we not just moving pieces around a board from planet to planet to planet? Because that's what Medieval 1 was, and technically it's like moving chess pieces around a board. It's not going to be very dynamic like Rome Total War 1 was. So let's turn to battles. And of course, with Star Wars, you have two separate battle experiences. So let's get the easy one out of the way first. The reason that Star Wars Empire at War is so successful and still being played today is because they absolutely nailed the space battles. And it's been brought up to semi-modern standards by the mods. You have the scale, you have the awesomeness of slow-moving Star Destroyers versus the nimble, more numerous Rebel capital ships, gigantic Super Star Destroyers just blowing you away with their magnitude. And this is what the game really succeeded on. All Total War has to do is use this framework and make it look insane. And of course, there are many ways to make it better too, for sure. I'm sure you guys have suggestions. Please leave them down below. But the fundamentals should remain. If CA can nail the space battles, this could be a fantastic game regardless of other stuff. But, people are not going to want to play a campaign that's terrible. They're going to want to play these epic space battles. So you've got to nail several parts of it to make it a really incredible game. But nailing this is an easy win. It really is. However, land battles are a lot more complicated and are going to take some serious thought to get right. But the first step is to choose the correct era for conflict. Now, you may think, I'm sure, space battles are cool in the Republic era, in the Empire era. Yes, that's true. And even though a lot of people want Darth Vader, they want Luke Skywalker, New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, the factions that are represented are just not sufficient for a Total War game, and I'll explain why. For example, you have in Empire Strikes Back Imperial versus Rebels, right? And a Rebel faction is always extremely difficult to play, to develop in a game like Total War, because traditionally, as we saw, for example, in the Star Wars Battle of Hoth, when the Imperials and the Rebels face off against each other on an open, even match, the Rebels have absolutely no chance, and they shouldn't have any chance. That's the point. The Rebels have to use guerrilla-style tactics. You can't come toe-to-toe with the Empire on a field. There are so many examples of this in history. The American Independence Forces versus the British Redcoats couldn't stand up toe-to-toe. Romans versus the Gauls, Britons or Germanics, even when they managed to trap the Romans at Alesia and outnumber them by hundreds of thousands, discipline and coordination gave the Romans the day. And even when an extremely small force faced Boudicca, who was a competent commander and greatly outnumbered the Romans still won. The only way they managed to defeat the Roman legions was, of course, the infamous ambush at Teutoburg Forest. And the only reason they managed to do that was because they caught the Romans on the march. They caught them in ambush. So this was multiple legions, but they used guerrilla tactics. They ambushed them, they caught them on the march. That's the kind of tactics you have to use as a rebel player. And we see similar traps employed that were employed in Return of the Jedi in the Ewok ambush, when the Empire deployed their best troops in unfavorable conditions. They managed to lose. And the problem with this is that guerrilla tactics are not easy. They're not easy to teach. They're complex, require significant experience and knowledge in warfare. They don't fit in a Total War battle system. Yes, other games have had ambush battles, and they work 50% of the time. It's not really very well put together in the older Total War's ambush battles, but guerrillas hit their opponent's supply lines. They use localization of force, like in Teutoburg Forest, to overwhelm small isolated garrisons or pockets of armies on the march. They hide in urban areas or wildernesses. But because there are two major factions, you have one which is a traditional empire versus a untraditional, rebel style faction. And of course, it's insane to suggest that the rebels own planets. They only have bases on those planets. Even in movies, they're hidden. The Empire doesn't know they're there. You can't own a planet, but probably still Empire forces on it. So what you'll have is planets that you would ideally think as of cities in the original historical games. But now, rebels and the Empire can own them simultaneously, so things start to get little confusing. It's also really hard to use guerrilla tactics, rebel tactics, whatever you want to call it, on a campaign map that would be spread not over multiple cities and provinces like in every other Total War game, which you could theoretically use it traditionally on, but over multiple planets. It's really weird to have campaign maps of each individual planet, because one, that's insanely taxing on the player. You have to go to the planet, you have to go into the campaign map, remember exactly where everything is, come out on a different planet and go back in. Your turns are going to take hours, but also because the only function of those campaign maps inside planets will be to hunt down rebels and for the rebels to ambush the Imperials. So if you're playing as the Imperials and there's a rebel base on the planet, all you have to do is flood the planet. You're not going to get ambushed per se because you know they're there. You're also not going to, on planets that you own and for some reason you don't know there are rebels there, you're not just going to move forces around anyway. You're just going to take off and land, aren't you? They're not going to be patrolling or whatever. And so rebels can't ambush your supply lines. It just doesn't seem to work very well in this grand scheme of things. So the rebels hide on planets and then they, launch attacks on the Death Star, but that's not very interesting if that's the only thing that happens, is it? So I'm hoping that I'm starting to get across how difficult a Total War Star Wars game is to create. And obviously you could break this rule and have the Imperials and rebels face each other across a traditional Total War battlefield style. Even if you did that, what do the rebels really have against AT-ATs, land speeders, and it just doesn't, you can't really match it very easily, can you? Personally, I think that the rebels are so outmatched in an open fight that it's just going to be impossible to win. I hope I've explained why I don't think the New Hope era is the best time period, although it's still possible, it's not impossible. I'm sure there's going to be a separate game for this one. I'm happy to see it as long as it works, but I just don't see the factions are equals on a Total War style game. But if any era is going to have a chance of success, of course it's the Clone Wars. Clones versus droids reminds me of a more traditional Total War battle. You've got your two sides, they have similar weaponry and they both use similar tactics. We all remember the battle in Phantom Menace of Naboo, Geonosis. This could work, Droids are your dream faction if you're a classically styled Total War player. Easy to control, You've got tanks and artillery. It's a very, very, very traditional style. You can have large numbers of droids on the field, but the key difference, droids have limited emotion, easily replaceable, especially battle droids that are specifically programmed to fight in a certain way. But clones do have emotion, and even though technically they are mass-produced like the droids, in battle they take cover behind objects. You rarely see droids take any sort of cover, and they're able to think outside the box, the clones are. Unlike the droids, which are programmed in a certain way, sluggish, slow-moving, don't really have any tactical overall strategic plan apart from just to plow forward and destroy the enemy. But here's the problem: unlike droids who can form huge battle lines, clones fight differently. They don't fight in formation. They more so fight similar to World War I, World War II soldiers, modern day infantry. They're not going to do a traditional line battle. They don't want to stand opposite droid units and get ploughed down. Because remember, this isn't Empire Total War, this isn't Napoleon, where muskets had to be used in large quantities in big units to gain any sort of accuracy. These are Star Wars blasters, which are dramatically more accurate than a musket, and if employed in a unit versus unit sort of line battle, you're going to wipe each other out in mere seconds, surely. Clones use a lot more modern day infantry tactics, and the biggest one you can see from the movie is a breakdown of unit size. Droids may deploy 100 models per unit, and more often than not in these unit versus unit battles, the droids would win. Not because they're better shooters, in fact they're not, I don't think, but because their morale won't break, because they're droids, they're meant to be sacrificed, they have no emotion to them, so they'll easily beat the clones because the clones will start losing and they'll start pulling back. There's a reason why the Gungans used force-filled shields on Naboo. That wasn't because the Gungans weren't as good a shot as a droid, probably better in every way. The droids would shoot endless volleys into the Gungan ranks. They would succeed in breaking the Gungans even if the casualty ratio was 2-1, 3-1, 4-1. They'd just keep coming, and that's why they had to use these shields to try and even the fight. And that's a great faction there, the Gungans. You could have them as a faction, completely different style of warfare to any other faction, which is pretty cool. Blasters, even though they are not powerful compared to other weapons like artillery or tanks or whatever, can be so efficient if they're used in large numbers, as you see with these droids. So if you want to be successful in a Star Wars Total War battle, use of cover and range of weapons is important. And my worry is that battles are going to become bogged down. Either that or the AI is going to put themselves in increasingly stupid positions, launching charges against extremely strong clone positions, and this could get extremely boring and time consuming. Unlike a World War I game though, maneuverability and use of machines, aircraft could play a role in breaking this deadlock, so it's not impossible. It's just if you have an infantry versus infantry fight, you're not going to want to commit your infantry, because if you walk into a field of fire, you're just going to get wiped out. It's going to be really difficult to balance the accuracy of a unit versus realism. There is a way through this though, but it will not look like a traditional Total War land battle game. It will not even look like Warhammer, but it'll be a battle of attrition, using aircrafts and tanks to break a deadlock between infantry fights. I think it could work, but if we have a very similar experience every battle of that, unit versus unit line style, it'll look very weird and become very repetitive very quickly. And of course, there is another key factor here. Environments play a key part in breaking up this style of line battle engagements. Hopefully what that'll do is make units more tactical. There's one last component, maybe the most important component to Star Wars, and that is of course the Jedi versus Sith and the Force. This is the problem with the Clone Wars period. There are only very, very few Sith, right, in this time period, not like the mass ranks of the Jedi, and so using them is going to be extremely pivotal and also extremely difficult. Jedi and Sith are single combatants. They're not able to take on mass infantry. We saw this, and remember the Jedi swooping down on these gunships to save Anakin and Padme in the Clone Wars. They're not able to take on mass infantry. We get dropped down. Basically all of them die, or most of them die. They don't have magic thick skin, okay? And obviously different Jedi have different powers, right? But if you have 100 droids versus one Jedi at range, it's very likely the Jedi is going to lose, right? This can be also demonstrated in Order 66, for example. A lot of Jedis were ambushed, yeah. Most of them died though, right? If they can't stand against a handful of clones, even if they were in a bad position, how can you possibly imagine them taking on hundreds of them and hundreds of droids at a time in mass battles? And so Jedi are special forces units, basically. They're used effectively as army commanders or alongside other elite units. You could attach them to clone commandos, for example.
Sir, I have 5 special commando units awaiting your order, sir.
The problem then arises of how you implement them in combat, right? And it only takes one blaster bolt or one, lightsaber slash to kill a Jedi or Sith. They aren't hit point sponges. Warhammer Lords are, and that's okay because that's how the game works as a tabletop. But Jedi aren't. Qui-Gon Jinn takes one stab to the stomach and dies. Jedi takes blaster bolts all the time, and they can't just take them and live forever. It's not how it works at all. If a Jedi has to get hit 200 times by blaster bolts before they die in a battle, it's going to look ridiculous, isn't it? If there's a hitbox above their head and the hitbox is going down as they take hundreds of blaster bolts from clones and they're still standing, it's going to look really weird. Star Wars, when it comes down to it, is gritty. Just like the original Total War game, you'd have armor values and things like that, but if you just see 100 blaster bolts hit a Jedi and it just stays standing, I think it's going to be completely ridiculous. I don't really have an answer for this part either. I don't know how to implement Jedi into a game unless they are tagged on to an already existing unit and sort of play a part in that unit, with support. Otherwise, if they're isolated, maybe that's part of the gameplay. If they get isolated, they die easily. And that may be the only way to do it, but I doubt it. I reckon that Jedi are going to be these individual characters that wander around the map and do incredible damage, just like in Warhammer, and it's going to look ridiculous. I really hope that isn't the way they go, but I can imagine it would be, because that's how they've done it in Warhammer, that's how they've done it in Three Kingdoms. Again, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, because it's really an open book discussion at this point. Star Wars Empire Wars' biggest weakness was land battles. It was really, really clunky and hitboxy. It wasn't really very realistic like the space battles were. But whatever happens, something's going to have to drastically change. Downscaling it may be the only way, so you're playing a more of a Men of War style. But importantly, you can't just reskin Total War Warhammer 3. So I hope you've enjoyed exploring what a Star Wars game would look like. There are lots of challenges to overcome. It's going to be a risk and a shot in the dark, in my opinion. It may work, it may not. If any one of these three sections of the game, campaign, space battles especially, or land battles, are failures, it could make the game extremely unplayable. But if they can pull it off, which I really hope they can, I reckon it could be the most successful Total War game ever, because you're dragging in a huge player base. I can think of every Star Wars fan that may not have been a Total War fan will want to play this game if it's a good game, and you could bring in hundreds of thousands of players immediately into this franchise. Like and subscribe for more Total War content. Take care.